In 1902, the city of Hanoi faced a serious rat problem. The French government's solution seemed logical enough. Offer a bounty for each rat tail turned in. Citizens could bring in rat tails and receive payment, creating what appeared to be a perfect incentive system to reduce the rat population. Initially, the program looked successful as people brought in thousands of rat tails. But something unexpected happened. The rat population didn't decrease. Instead, people had begun breeding rats to collect the bounty. This story, now known as a classic example of the Cobra effect, illustrates something fundamental about human behavior and measurement systems. When we focus on optimizing for a single metric, people will always find ways to improve that metric, but not always in the ways we intended or that actually solve the underlying problem. In product development and team leadership, we face this same challenge constantly. We create measurement systems that seem perfectly logical, only to discover they shape organizational behavior in ways we never anticipated. And it makes sense that we do this. Humans are inherently drawn to simplification. We look for shortcuts, clear boundaries, and black and white definitions that make it easier for our brains to process complex situations. This is exactly why concepts like North Star metrics became so popular. When Sean Ellis first introduced the idea, he wasn't thinking about it as an oversimplification. As an experienced product leader, he understood it as part of a larger framework, one piece of a complex system. But that's not how many product leaders use it today. In this module, we'll explore why our natural tendency towards simplification, while understandable, can lead us astray when measuring product success. We'll examine actual examples of companies that fell into the trap of single metric thinking, understand the warning signs of metric fixation, and learn how to develop more sophisticated measurement systems that account for the complex reality of product development. When I worked at Kmart, and yes, I'm dating myself here, corporate came up with what they thought was a brilliant metric. They wanted to measure how quickly cashiers could check out customers. The logic seemed sound. Faster checkout times would mean happier customers, giving us a competitive advantage over Walmart and other retailers. The metric was simple. Measure the time between scanning the first item and completing the transaction. What happened next was a perfect example of how people optimize for metrics in ways that don't necessarily achieve the intended goal. We cashiers started arranging all the items from a customer's cart on the belt before scanning anything, carefully positioning every barcode for optimal scanning. Then we'd scan everything incredibly quickly and mark the transaction as complete before we'd even started bagging the items. Did we get outstanding scores on our metric? Absolutely. Did we win awards from corporate? You bet we did. But did we improve the customer experience? Not really. We'd added time up front to arrange items and time at the end for bagging. The total checkout experience wasn't faster. We optimized for the specific segment being measured. The Kmart story highlights something more profound than just clever employees gaming a system. It shows how humans naturally respond to measurement by optimizing what's being measured, often in ways that miss the larger purpose. But why do we do this? To understand that, we need to talk about why systems thinking is so hard for us humans. Why do we struggle so much with systems thinking? Imagine trying to predict the weather. You might start by looking at temperature. That seems straightforward enough. But temperature affects air pressure, which influences wind patterns, impacts cloud formation, and then circles back to affect temperature. Each element interacts with and influences the others in complex feedback loops. Product development works the same way. Every decision, every metric, and every change ripples through the system in ways that aren't immediately obvious. When we launch a new feature, it doesn't just affect user engagement. It impacts server load, which affects performance, which influences user satisfaction, which changes usage patterns, which alters our infrastructure needs. And that's just one chain of consequences. Our brains aren't naturally wired to think this way. We prefer linear cause and effect relationships. If we do X, we get Y. It's much harder to hold in our heads all the interconnected ways that X might influence A through Z, and how those changes might loop back to affect X itself. This is why we gravitate towards simple metrics. They give us the illusion of control and understanding in a complex system. But here's the problem. When we oversimplify complex systems into single metrics, we don't actually make the system simpler. We just blind ourselves to its complexity. It's like trying to understand an entire symphony by only measuring how loud it is. Yes, you can measure volume easily, But optimizing for volume alone won't get you better music. This challenge becomes even more pronounced in complex environments like software development and product management. When we tell teams this is the measure of your success, we're not just giving them a goal, we're shaping how they think about their work and make decisions. Let's look at some common examples from software development that show this pattern. When teams are measured purely on story points completed, we see story point inflation. Teams start estimating higher points for the same work. When they're measured on lines of code written, we get unnecessarily verbose code that's hard to maintain. When they're measured solely on feature shipping velocity, we accumulate technical debt that slows us down in the long run. This isn't because teams are trying to game the system or act maliciously. Humans are just remarkably good at optimizing for whatever target we're given. The problem isn't with the people, it's with the oversimplification of complex systems into single metrics. This brings us to why North Star metrics became so popular and why they can be dangerous when used in isolation. A single clear metric is incredibly appealing. It makes conversations easier. It simplifies decision making. It gives everyone a shared goal to rally around. But this simplification comes at a cost. Let's look at Netflix as an example. They initially focused heavily on watch time as their North Star metric. The logic seems straightforward. More watch time meant more engaged users, which should lead to more subscribers and revenue. But here's where it gets complicated. Netflix makes money through monthly subscriptions, not through minutes watched. A subscriber who watches 2 hours of high-quality content that perfectly matches their interests might be more likely to maintain their subscription than someone who binges on mediocre content for 10 hours. By focusing primarily on watch time, Netflix incentivized the creation of more content that would keep people watching, sometimes at the expense of quality. This created several problems. First, the flood of mediocre content made it harder for users to find the shows they truly love. Second, encouraging binge-watching patterns could lead to user burnout. Finally, and most importantly, optimizing for watch time didn't necessarily optimize for what actually drives revenue, getting people to start and maintain their subscriptions. This disconnect between the metric, watch time, and the business model, subscription revenue, is a perfect example how even seemingly logical North Star metrics can lead organizations astray. Netflix has since evolved to use a more sophisticated measurement system that better aligns with its business goals and user value. Medium provides another instructive example. They chose total time reading as their North Star metric. Again, the logic seems sound. More time spent reading should indicate more engaging content, right? But what actually happened? Writers began padding their articles to increase reading time. The platform optimized design to keep people on pages longer, even if that meant a worse reading experience. Eventually, top writers began leaving the platform because they felt the focus on reading time didn't align with their goals of producing high-quality, concise content. The most dramatic example is MoviePass. Their singular focus on subscriber growth led them to offer an unsustainable pricing model, $9.95 monthly for unlimited movies. They achieved their metric goal spectacularly, gaining millions of subscribers. But they lost money on virtually every transaction, eventually leading to the company's collapse. They hit their North Star metric target and went out of business doing it. So how can you tell if your organization is falling into the trap of metric fixation? There are several warning signs to watch for. First, look for teams optimizing for numbers over value. If you see engineers inflating story points or content creators sacrificing quality for quantity, that's a red flag. Second, watch for declining quality in areas that aren't being measured. This often shows up as technical debt in software development, where teams rush to ship features to hit metrics while code quality suffers. Third, pay attention to cultural indicators. When teams start competing against each other in unhealthy ways, or when innovation decreases because people are afraid to experiment with anything that might hurt their metrics, you're seeing the dark side of metric fixation. Let's pause for a moment and discuss how you can evaluate your organization's measurement systems. It's one thing to understand these concepts in theory, it's another to spot these patterns when you're in the middle of them. Start by examining your team's day-to-day behaviors. When people discuss success in your organization, what language do they use? If conversations consistently revolve around a single number, whether that's user growth, revenue, or engagement, That's your first warning sign. Not because these metrics aren't important, but because complex systems rarely have simple measures of success. Next, look at how decisions are made. When your team debates different approaches, what factors drive the discussion? If you hear phrases like, "this will hurt our numbers," or "this will help us hit our target," dig deeper. What other considerations might be getting overlooked? What long-term consequences might be ignored in favor of short-term metric improvements? Consider running this thought experiment. If your current metrics suddenly doubled overnight, would that be unquestionably good news? For instance, if your user engagement metric doubled, would that automatically mean your product is twice as successful? Or could there be scenarios where higher engagement actually signals problems, like users struggling to complete tasks or addictive but ultimately unhealthy usage patterns? Pay particular attention to what's not being measured. In software development, technical debt is often invisible in short-term metrics. In product development, user frustration might not show up in engagement numbers. In team management, burnout rarely appears in productivity metrics. What essential factors in your system might be invisible to your current measurements? Finally, examine the incentive structure around your metrics. Are bonuses, promotions, or other rewards tied to specific numbers? Remember, what you measure becomes what you manage, but what you reward signals what you value. If your measurement and reward systems aren't carefully aligned, you might encourage behavior that works against your goals. The key is to remember that measurement systems, like the products we build, require regular maintenance and adjustment. They should evolve as our understanding deepens and our needs change. Think of them as hypotheses about what matters most in your system. Hypotheses that should be regularly tested and refined. Those incentives I mentioned earlier dramatically amplify the effects of our management systems, and I want to spend more time talking about them. When organizations tie rewards directly to metrics, through bonuses, promotions, or performance reviews, they create a powerful multiplier effect that can reshape entire cultures. Let me share a story from a consulting company I worked with. They had two regional teams, one in Europe and one in North America. Each team had its own leader, and both were measured primarily on billable hours. Simple enough, right? Measure utilization, reward high performance, and watch productivity increase. But here's what actually happened. The teams started competing over how to classify work hours. When projects involved both regions, each team tried to claim more of the billable hours for their metrics. Sometimes they would refuse to let team members help with projects in the other region, even when they had the perfect expertise for the job, because those hours would count toward the other team's metrics. Why did smart, well-intentioned leaders behave in a way that hurt the company and its customers? Because their compensation and career advancement were tied directly to the single metric. The incentive structure turned what should have been collaborative teams into competitors. This pattern repeats across industries. When sales teams are rewarded solely on new customer acquisition, they might sign customers who aren't a good fit for the product. When engineering teams' bonuses depend on shipping velocity, technical debt accumulates. Product bloat becomes inevitable when product managers' promotions hinge on feature launches. Think about the implicit message we send when we tie rewards to metrics. We're not just saying, this is important to measure. We're saying, this is what we value above all else. When you tell someone their bonus depends on hitting a specific number, you're telling them to optimize for that number at the expense of everything else. Despite these risks, we should still use metrics in our reward systems, but we must be thoughtful and systematic about structuring incentives. A sound incentive system looks at the whole picture rather than hanging everything on a single number. It considers what happened this quarter, but also looks at the long-term health of the product and the team. Think about how venture capitalists evaluate startups. They don't just look at revenue or growth. They examine the quality of the team, the market potential, the competitive landscape, and dozens of other factors. We must bring that same holistic thinking to evaluating and rewarding our teams. This might mean combining quantitative metrics with qualitative assessments and looking at both individual contributions and team collaboration, and measuring both immediate results and investments in future capabilities. The key is creating incentive structures that encourage people to think beyond the immediate numbers. When team members know they'll be evaluated on both the quality and quantity of their work and on both their individual achievements and their contributions to team success, they're more likely to make balanced decisions that benefit the organization as a whole. Now that we understand the complex interplay between measurement systems and incentives, let's talk about how to build better, more sophisticated approaches to measuring success. So what's the alternative if a single North Star metric isn't enough? The answer isn't to abandon metrics altogether. It's to build more sophisticated measurement systems that capture the complexity of what we're trying to achieve. Think about looking up at the night sky. The North Star might be your primary reference point, but you don't navigate by that alone. You need to see the whole constellation, understand how the stars relate to each other, and often track multiple reference points to know where you're really going. The same is true for product measurement. You need a balanced set of metrics that capture both user success and business health. You need counter metrics, or guardrails, that help prevent unintended consequences. For instance, if growth is your North Star metric, you might use retention as a counter metric to ensure you're not just acquiring users who immediately churn. More importantly, you must remember that metrics serve your strategy. They don't define it. They should be tools for understanding and improving, not ends in themselves. You must be willing to change metrics when they stop serving their purpose and always keep sight of the actual value you're trying to create for users and the business. Let's talk about what a more sophisticated measurement system looks like in practice. Consider a company focused on user acquisition. Instead of just tracking new signups, they might implement a primary metric that tracks new user acquisition, balanced by retention metrics that ensure these users stick around, quality metrics that monitor the user experience and product performance, preventing growth at the expense of user satisfaction, business health metrics that ensure growth is happening sustainably and profitably, and input metrics that teams can directly influence, giving them actionable ways to contribute to larger goals. This approach creates a more complete picture of success. It helps prevent the unintended consequences we've discussed while providing clear direction for teams. Remember the Hanoi rat story we started with? The problem wasn't that they measured something. It was that they measured only one thing and assumed that would drive the right behavior. This kind of story can be incredibly powerful when you're talking with stakeholders about measurement systems. Everyone understands that complex problems require thoughtful solutions, not oversimplified metrics. The next time someone asks you to define a single metric for success, remind them that no experienced navigator relies on a single star, no doctor diagnoses based on a single vital sign, and no successful business thrives by optimizing a single number. Our job as product leaders isn't to oversimplify complexity, it's to build measurement systems that help us understand and navigate it. The following modules will explore specific frameworks and approaches for building these more sophisticated measurement systems. But for now, remember, no single metric can tell the whole story in the complex world of product development. The key is building measurement systems as sophisticated as the products and teams they're meant to guide.